So today we're going to be looking at the divisions and the sects which exist within Judaism. And it's important to remember that for most of the history of Judaism, Orthodox Judaism was Judaism. There was no other version of it. Reform Judaism is a development that comes with modernity and comes with assimilation. And so Reform Judaism is going to emerge out of the United States, but is also going to be one that is going to be increasingly prominent with larger and larger numbers of Jews living in societies where they simply can't live the way that they used to in Orthodox Judaism. So if you look at Orthodox Judaism on the left, and this is the traditional form of what Judaism was, you can see it begins with dietary laws, which we'll talk about in just a second. Very strict observance of the Sabbath, to the point where Orthodox Jews will refuse to turn on and off lights because that's, as they interpret it, the lighting of fire, and that was not permitted on the Sabbath. So in Israel, Jews will hire goys or non-Jews to come in and do things for them, everything from the work that they need to do to turning on and off lights, in order to observe the Sabbath as completely as possible. They pray a lot more frequently, and there is a separation of men and women in religious settings. So you see that also in Islam, very similar. Because Torah is revealed to the Jews at Sinai, they take the words of the Torah way more seriously, a little bit more literally. And they believe that Israel is obviously part of the original covenant. And so Zionism and the political loyalty to the state of Israel is extremely important to Orthodox Jews, whereas Reform Jews have more of a tendency to criticize Israel. You just can't do that. In Judaism, you have to be completely all in on whatever the state is doing. There's a very strong emphasis on preventing intermarriage. It's basically against the law to marry anyone other than another Jew. This is because Jews have always been a minority in the societies in which they live, and also because they live in an ethical way which separates them, and they want to stay separated for the sake of preserving this identity and this ethical purity that comes from the religion. And so again, they want to preserve all aspects of the Jewish law. There are 613 commandments laid out in the Torah, and they want to observe all 613 of them. And so not only is it about the reading of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, but it's also about all the commentary on the Torah. So there's something called the Talmud. The Talmud is a lot more heavily emphasized in Orthodox Judaism. If you look over to the right with Reform Judaism, there's a lot more of an emphasis on assimilation. They abandoned the dietary rules. There's a lot more of a movement against the hierarchy of men being higher than women. So there's more emphasis on equality. And they allow for much more of an individual interpretation of the laws themselves. So it's much more modern. It's much more liberal, if you want to think about it that way. And again, it's much more recent. So let's go back to Orthodox Judaism. And it begins with some of these things I've already mentioned. But I think that from all of these things here, the emphasis on Hebrew language, and also Orthodox Jews will dress differently. They will put on the tefillin, and we'll talk more about what that is. But the use of the yarmulke, all of these things to identify yourself as being Jewish, as being separate. Begins with dietary laws. So kashrut or Jewish kosher law is essentially a set of 27 dietary laws. But the 4 most important are that if you're going to eat an animal, a bird or an animal, it has to be killed by a Jewish butcher. And that also means there are prayers that are going to be said over these animals by rabbis before they're killed. So again, it provides an ethical way of killing, and allows for sort of religious sanction for it. The draining of blood from the meat and the poultry is another piece of that. There's no such thing as a rare steak in in Orthodox Judaism. This idea that you remove the blood from the meat before you eat it. The idea of meat not being eaten with dairy is important because this idea that you don't cook a child's in its mother's milk, essentially. So that also is very much about the ethics of food consumption. Even this idea of strictly managing which things come in contact with meat, which things come in contact with dairy is taken extremely seriously. So Orthodox kitchens are very, very strict about that. And you really can't eat, if you are an Orthodox Jew, you really can't eat anywhere in another Orthodox house or in an Orthodox situation. So if you look at this, it was this idea of morality. It was this idea to foster this collective identity and to follow the rules. And it was about self-discipline and being able to follow the things that God said. So not only did he give you the 10 commandments on Sinai, he gave you the other 603. And if you look at Orthodox Jewish kitchens, they have a meat dishwasher, they have a dairy dishwasher. Every kitchen is divided in half. So if you look at this, everything to the left side would be the meat side, everything on the right side would be the dairy side. So all of the plates, the silverware, the pots and pans, everything, you'll have two separate things. You'll even have two different refrigerators for meat and dairy. So if you go into a kosher supermarket, you'll see everything is separated as well in those settings. So there's this extremely strict setting for food preparation. Now, obviously, if you can't eat in non-kosher families, you aren't going to spend any time with them. So this idea is you're separating yourself intentionally by your food consumption and preparation. You're separating your community from everyone else. And that's going to be extremely important. So it begins with dietary laws. It also emerges with the way that the religions actually practice the use of tefillin in the Shema. There's this idea that you keep the Torah at the center of your attention. So they literally keep the Torah in a small box that's put on the center of their forehead. The tefillin also, there is another box that's on the forearm. The symbolism is you're literally binding yourself in the commandments. You're wrapping yourself up in the Torah law as you get ready to practice it. So there's much more of a sense of adherence to the law in this. Now, Reform Judaism is a completely different thing. The question that Jews had in the 19th century was, okay, we're living in secular societies. We're living in large non-Jewish cultures, and we are a minority. So how do we be both Americans or Europeans and also Jews? And as the Jews, just like the Christians, began to look at their religion in a more of a rational way after the Enlightenment, they began to look at what being Jewish really was about being a good person. And so we're going to focus primarily on the laws that are laid out in the 10 Commandments. We're going to focus on, because those are all ethical laws, but we're not going to look at these things as necessarily given by God. They're just good ideas. They're in the same way that a more liberal Christian might say, I don't believe in Jesus as the Son of God literally, but I think he has some good teaching. So the same idea. So they're emphasizing learning, and they're emphasizing more egalitarianism and social justice. So a lot of Reform Jews are heavily engaged in social justice movements. And again, this idea of Jewish identity being a little bit more loosely defined. So in both the Reform and conservative traditions, we have the use of the talit, which is the prayer shawl. That prayer shawl has traditionally the blue and white, which is the colors of Israel. So it's the connection to the original tribal identity of the people. The 613 commandments are actually represented by the knots at the bottom. So even a Reform Jew may use a talit, which is sort of like a looser version of the tefillin. And again, it speaks to, even for Reform Jews, the need to have a commitment. So Reform Judaism is making Judaism more accessible. The idea of interfaith dialogue is important. They're not as wrapped up in Jews marrying other Jews. And of course, this gets Orthodox Jews to be extremely upset at Reform Jews, because they believe that if everybody becomes a Reform Jew and everybody marries somebody who's not Jewish, eventually you're going to destroy the religion entirely. In fact, there was an Orthodox rabbi who said, the most successful destroyers of Judaism wasn't Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. It was all of these Reform Jews that sort of happily went about abandoning all of their connection to their religion and to the laws. So again, the existence of women rabbis and the less nationalist reaction to Israel is another piece of what it means to be a Reform Jew. So if you look at where Reform Judaism comes from, the Pittsburgh Platform in 1885, so late 19th century, you'll notice here that we accept only as binding moral laws, which we've already talked about. But the laws that regulate diet and priestly purity and all of these things, we're not going to abide by those things. So this idea of personal autonomy and the idea of looking at the religion as really emphasizing righteousness is more important. So this is much more about allowing individuals to decide what kind of religion they want to practice on their own terms, and that's going to be extremely important. So this comes down to this question. This is the underlying question for Jews and also for religious or less religious people, which is, okay, if Judaism is defined by the law, then is following a strict set of laws and having your behavior and belief regulated by principled guidelines, is that going to allow you to live a more moral and fulfilling life? And will that allow you to really build your identity? Or is it about deciding for yourself how to live and how to incorporate your religion into your own life? So that, in other words, is autonomy more important to you and freedom? Or is it more important to be part of a group and principled and having guidelines too? And again, this is partly a sense of, it's based on sensibility and culture, but it's the fundamental difference. Obviously, for Orthodox Jews, it's going to be A is the answer, and for Reform Jews, B is going to be the answer. When you look at divisions in Judaism, obviously there's also the Hasidic Jews. The Hasidic Jews are a variation of Orthodox Jews, but they're not as heavily into the all of the heavy scriptural study, and they're more into kind of emotional connection to God. So it's like a bhakti yoga approach to Judaism. So the Hasidic Jews are even more divided. Most of them now live in New York and Brooklyn. They have kind of a cult-like identity. They literally, if you leave the community, you're excommunicated, you're thrown out completely. You have to marry another Hasidic Jew. It's it's pretty much hasn't changed since its emergence in the late Middle Ages in Germany. So it has a very strict history about it. So just to review, if you look at Reform Judaism and the heavy emphasis on civil disobedience and social justice, this is much more about being a good person is defined by social engagement in the broader world and supporting other people, whether they are transgender people or gay people or immigrants or Black people. This is about, to be a good Jew is to bring your ethics into the world and to do so in a way where you're active. You can't be Jewish and just be a passive to these types of injustices, because otherwise you're ignoring your history, you're ignoring your culture. For an Orthodox Jew, that is not the answer. For an Orthodox Jew, you need to go back to the commandments, you need to go back to the traditions, and you need to embrace the rules that were laid down on Sinai. So the fundamental question here is what it means to be Jewish. How do you follow the law? How do you be a good person? And these are the fundamental differences that define the two major sects of Judaism.